Yesterday we started talking about quadratic equations that don't work. So up until like this week, we had a quadratic equation. You identify A, B, and C, put it into that equation, and you get two answers. But you see, yesterday we started talking about ones where if you put A, B, and C in, and you put in your quadratic formula, and you do it all right, get it in the calculator, and then it says domain error. That means that you don't have any real solutions. But what happens when you don't have any real solutions is you end up having imaginary ones. So let's go right over here. Make a little box underneath. I mean, I know there's not a lot of space, but what I want you to put in here is that quadratic formula. There's just enough space to squeeze it in right there. So, our quadratic formula. If you have a quadratic equation, the quadratic formula is always going to be able to help you solve it, but you might have to be a little bit smarter than your calculator. Remember how it was like x equals negative b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Alright, so here's your quadratic formula. You got identify A, B, and C, and you got this quadratic formula. However, any time that you have a square root, there's potential for a problem to arise. What is never allowed to be under that root? Negative number. And it's very possible with your B and your A and C that when you go b squared minus 4ac, somehow it comes out negative. That's when you're going to have a problem, and that's when your calculator is not going to accept your quadratic formula. So let's look at this first problem. We've got x squared plus 16 equals 0. Now, I need you to tell me, how do you know that the thing on the board is a quadratic equation at all? It's got x squared. And there's no x3s, x4s, x5s, and it's an equation because you got an equal sign. So anytime you have a quadratic equation, there's multiple ways to solve it. But one way is to use the quadratic formula. That's a really, really good way. You just have to identify A, B, and C. So what's my A? 1. And my B?
0.
And then my C?
16.
So if I go to put this into the calculator with 1, 0, and 16, I'm going to start by saying x equals negative b, which is x equals negative 0. And negative 0 is 0, same thing. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 0 squared, minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Now, normally I'm going to hit enter and get an answer. But check out what's happening under this root. 0 squared is 0. So you're getting ready to do 0 minus 4 times 1 times 16. Any clue what 4 times 1 times 16 is? What's 4 times 1?
Negative 16.
Negative, it's bigger. Negative 64. So what is 0 minus 64? Negative 64. So you have a negative 64 under that root. Therefore, when I hit enter, I get this. Because 0 squared, now without the root, 0 squared minus 4 times 1 times 16 is negative 64. So what you have is, you have a little problem. So what we're going to do, when the calculator won't work for us, let's write it out on paper. So go ahead and write it out. Let's go x equals negative b, so x equals negative 0, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, which is b squared, 0 squared minus 4 times 1 times 16 all over 2a, which is 2 times 1. And this is no good. It doesn't work because what is under the root? What is this really happening right here? Negative, yeah. And specifically, it's negative what? 64. So let's go ahead and let's scratch this out because we know what it is. All this I highlighted right here. Scratch it out and put negative 64. Under the root, though, so maybe extend the root just a little bit. I know what all that junk is. It's negative 64. All right, now here's where you have to go back and remember, okay, you can't have negatives under roots. That's where imaginary numbers come from, is the negatives under the roots. So what do we do with this? Put an I right here and then turn that into what? Positive. So when you have a negative under a root, okay, so it's not a real number, so you put the I right here, change it to positive. And now what you really have is 0 plus or minus, so I don't really need 0 plus or minus. I'm just going to say plus or minus I squared root of 64 over 2. But I think I know what the square root of 64 is.
8.
It's just 8. And if you don't know what the square root of 64 is, okay. What times itself is 64? 8 times 8. So I'm going to turn this into just 8i. So it's plus or minus 8i over 2. And then what do you think happens with 8 over 2? Yeah, it's just 4i. Equals 4i.
Would it be plus or minus 4i or just 4i?
Oh yeah, plus or minus 4i. Plus or minus 4. It's plus or minus 8i over 2, so now it's going to be plus or minus 4i. And if you're looking on multiple choice, that's what you're looking for. Plus or minus 4i. Okay, now, one thing I want to do. The answer is plus or minus 4i. And we use the quadratic formula to do that. And as some of you probably saw, that can be tedious. There's room for mistakes. Like I almost forgot the plus or minus until Tyler helped me. Let me show you another way. Sometimes the quadratic formula is great, and it always works, even if you have to work it out on paper. Let me show you another way to do this problem. Go to the back side. Because we don't have anything on here. I want you to go ahead and write x squared plus 16 equals 0. There is another way to do this quadratic equation, and it's called just taking the square root. If there is no b, do you see a b? No. If there's no b, you can use this method really quick. Bless you. All right. Take everything except for x squared and move it over to the right. So here's x squared. Move that 16 over to the right. So subtract it over there. And I've got x squared equals negative 16. Now here's how it works. And some of you who had geometry last year, you remember we talked about a squared, b squared, c squared, and how to solve. When you have x squared, to unsquare it, what do? Square root both sides and put a plus or minus on the right. So to unsquare this x, square root the left and right. But the right side gets a little plus and minus. And the reason that works is because when you square root a square, it crosses out. Square rooting squares. It's all gone. And you have x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 16. Now, here's where your issue is. You have a square root with a negative under it. That's not okay. What needs to happen when you have this negative 16?
Imaginary, put the I.
Put the I here and pretend that that's positive. So this becomes plus or minus the square root of 16. What's the square root of 16? 4. And you're done. That's it. That's it. X equals plus or minus. This turns into a 4, so it's 4i. That's an alternative to the quadratic formula. And as you see, that one, less steps, less chances to make mistakes. But the thing you got to remember is, when can we do this? What has to be happening in the original problem? No b. If there's no b, just move all business over there to the right side until you have x squared and solve it up that way. We're going to have one more where this works. Like the very last one has no b as well. But let's look at one that does have a b. So going back to the front side, let's go back to problem number 2. Well, back there was a mess, so I'm going to grab another one. All right, here we go. X squared plus 3x plus 6. I'm already going to tell you there's no real solutions to this. So let's just go ahead and write it out. Put your quadratic formula underneath here. X equals negative b, so it's x equals negative what?
1.
Negative 3.
Oh, okay.
Here's your a, your b, and your c. So x equals negative b, x equals negative 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, so 3
Squared minus 4, 1 and 6.
1 and 6, all over 2a, so all over
2, 1.
2, 1. So you're going to have 2 down bottom. Okay, if there's no real solutions, the only reason that that's happening is because of what? Because you got a negative where? Right here. The only reason why this couldn't go into the calculator and give you an answer is if this is negative. This is 9 minus 24. See, 4 times 1 times 6. So what is your b squared minus 4ac doing? 3 squared minus 4 times a times c. 9 minus 24. It's negative 15. So what you've identified, the problem is that the stuff under it is negative 15. Now that we just do it separately, now I would scratch this out. All of this is just negative 15, so I'm just scratching it out, and I'm putting negative 15 in there. All right, now let's solve this problem. This is the problem right here, is this negative 15. What do you got to do with a negative under a root that kind of fixes it? Make it positive. Add an I out here. And then the big question is, does the square root of 15, positive 15, does that reduce at all?
No.
It doesn't. And that's fine. It doesn't reduce, just it's in the answer. So what you have is negative 3 plus or minus the I square root of 15 over 2. And that's it. It's done. And you'll see that in your answer. And the big thing to check for is make sure when you're doing your answers, make sure you got the I in there. Came from the fact that we couldn't put it in the calculator because this was negative. So you need negative 3 plus or minus I square root of 15 over 2. All right. And on to the last one. Whenever there's not a b, I would suggest doing the square root method, not the quadratic formula. Quadratic formula will work, for sure. But when there's no b, it's actually really easy to just move the 80 over and divide by 4. So let's go ahead and just do the square root method. First thing,
Negative.
minus the 80 over.
And divide the 4 off.
And then we'll divide the 4 off. I got 4x squared equals negative 80,
Makes it negative 20.
and it will be negative 20. After I divide by 4, I'm going to have x squared equals negative 20. At this point, you might see what's getting ready to happen. I'm getting ready to square root, and what's on the right side? A negative. So there's a red flag. Square root, both sides. What do you got to remember to put on the right side, though? Plus or minus. Plus or minus. So this crosses out. I'm out of paper here, so I'm going to go to the right. And I'm going to have x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 20. That isn't okay. What do you got to do about the negative under the root?
Make it a positive. And
Make it a positive and put an I right here. And then ask yourself, can I reduce the square root of 20?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that one
It'll
is.
be 2 square root 5.
It's going to be 2 square root of 5. Remember, there's an I in here, so where you can put the I?
2 imaginary square root of 5.
Yeah. 2I square root of 5. So when you reduce it, let's just put the I, plus or minus, don't forget that, 2I square root of 5. And that's it. Remember the difference between objective 119 and 120 is on 119 when it doesn't work, all you have to do is say, hey, it doesn't work. I have no real answers. On 120 when it doesn't work, you got to kind of work it out by hand and find out what's happening under the root that's causing it to be negative. And that is it for 1B. All right.